December 13th, 1943. The morning sun climbs slowly over Assam, India, burning through layers of mist that cling to the airfield like gauze. The air smells of dew-soaked earth and aviation fuel, mingled with the faint sweetness of tropical flowers blooming somewhere beyond the perimeter. Second Lieutenant Philip R. Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron stands beside his P-40N Warhawk, running his pre-flight check with methodical precision. He has named the aircraft Lulu Bell, the name painted in white script below the cockpit, alongside the shark mouth that grins from the engine, cowling in imitation of the famed flying tigers who pioneered these markings in combat against Japan. The morning is quiet. Too quiet. The other pilots of the Burma Banshees remain in their tents, emerging slowly for breakfast, their flight suits still unbuttoned, their faces creased with sleep. No missions are scheduled for the early hours. But Adair, restless with the nervous energy that afflicts young men far from home and waiting for war, has requested permission for a routine patrol. His squadron commander has granted it with a shrug. The skies belong to the Allies these days, at least in theory. One fighter patrolling at altitude will see nothing but endless jungle and empty sky. Adair climbs into the cockpit, settles into the bucket seat worn smooth by months of use, and fires the Allison V-1710 engine. The 12-cylinder power plant catches with a cough of blue smoke and settles into a throaty rumble that vibrates through the airframe. He releases the brakes and taxis to the runway, advancing the throttle, feeling Lulu Bell accelerate and lift cleanly into the humid air. He banks northeast and climbs, heading toward the patrol sector assigned by operations. Behind him, the airfield shrinks to a collection of tents and revetments barely visible against the jungle. Ahead lies only sky, vast, empty, innocent. He does not know that within minutes, he will face a choice between survival and duty, between the rational decision to flee and the impossible decision to fight alone against odds no pilot should accept. The story of what happened in the skies over Assam that morning is not merely about one pilot's courage, though courage was required in measure most men do not possess. It is about the collision of tactical doctrine and desperate improvisation, about the moment when training and instinct merge into action faster than conscious thought, and about the fundamental asymmetry between an aircraft designed for ruggedness and aircraft designed for elegance. It is about Second Lieutenant Philip Adair discovering in real time what many American pilots had learned painfully over 2 years of Pacific combat, that the P-40 Warhawk could not dogfight the Japanese Zero on the Zero's terms, could not outturn or outclimb the nimble Mitsubishi fighter that had terrorized Allied forces since Pearl Harbor. But the P-40 possessed attributes the Zero lacked: structural strength that allowed dives at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, armor plating that protected pilots from rear attacks, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented the catastrophic fires that consumed Japanese aircraft when hit, and 650 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose where convergence problems did not exist. These were the advantages that Flying Tiger's commander Claire Chennault had identified years earlier when he developed the hit-and-run tactics that would define P-40 combat doctrine. Never dogfight. Never turn with the enemy. Use altitude and speed. Dive, fire, escape. These principles had kept American pilots alive against superior Japanese maneuverability. They had turned the supposedly obsolete P-40 into an effective combat aircraft despite its limitations. And they were about to be tested under conditions more extreme than Chennault had ever envisioned. Adair levels off at 22,000 feet, scanning the horizon in the systematic pattern drilled into every fighter pilot. Eyes never rest. The sky that appears empty hides dangers invisible until the moment fighters emerge from sun glare or cloud shadow. He completes one circuit of his patrol sector, seeing nothing, beginning a second. Then, at the limit of visibility to the northeast, he notices something. Not aircraft yet, but a disturbance in the atmosphere itself, a shimmer, a darkness, a wrongness. He squints against the sun and counts. For aircraft? No, more than 4. A formation. A large formation. His pulse quickens. He advances the throttle and banks toward the contact, climbing another 1,000 feet to maintain altitude advantage. As the distance closes, the formation resolves into individual aircraft. Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers in a tight V formation, their twin engines glinting in the morning sun, bomb bay doors closed, heading southwest toward Allied positions. Adair's thumb moves instinctively to the gun button on his control stick. This is what fighter pilots train for: unescorted bombers, vulnerable and slow. He prepares to roll into a diving attack. Then he sees the escorts. Nakajima P-43 Oscar fighters, smaller and more maneuverable than the bombers, weaving above and beside the formation in protective pairs. He counts 20 fighters. No, 30. 40. The sky ahead is thick with Japanese aircraft. Not just the bombers he initially spotted, but a massive strike force comprising 24 bombers escorted by 40 fighters. 64 enemy aircraft. 1 P-40. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Standard operating procedure under these circumstances is equally simple. Break contact. Return to base. Radio a warning so ground defenses can prepare and additional fighters can scramble. No doctrine anywhere in any Air Force manual suggests that a single fighter should engage a formation of 64 enemy aircraft. Such an action is not brave but suicidal, a gesture that accomplishes nothing except adding one more name to the casualty lists. Adair's hand moves toward the radio transmitter, preparing to send the contact report. But even as he does, he calculates time and distance. The Japanese formation is 15 miles from his base. At their current speed, they will reach the airfield in less than 10 minutes. The Burma Banshees are on the ground, their aircraft parked in revetments, their pilots finishing breakfast or still sleeping off the previous night's poker game. If the Japanese bombers reach the base unmolested, they will destroy aircraft on the ground, crater runways, kill mechanics, and support personnel who have no warning and no shelter. 10 minutes is not enough time for fighters to scramble and climb to intercept altitude. By the time the first P-40s get airborne, the Japanese will already be dropping their bombs. The only aircraft with altitude and position to disrupt the attack is Lulu Bell. The only pilot who can delay the strike force long enough for the base to scramble fighters and disperse personnel is Philip Adair. The decision forms in his mind without conscious deliberation. He is not hero-seeking glory or death. He is a 22-year-old pilot from South Carolina who has been flying combat missions for less than 6 months, who writes letters home describing the boredom of patrol flights and the quality of food in the mess tent. But he understands with absolute clarity that if he does not engage this formation, men will die on the ground. His squadron mates, his friends. His duty is not to survive. His duty is to give them time. He pushes the throttle to maximum power and angles his dive toward the bomber formation. The Allison engine howls. The airspeed indicator climbs past 300 miles per hour, past 350, approaching 400. The P-40 is built for this. Heavy, rugged, faster in a dive than any Japanese aircraft can follow without risking structural failure. Chenault's doctrine plays in his head like a memorized prayer. Do not turn. Do not slow down. Make one pass. Fire. Extend away using superior dive speed. But the doctrine assumes escape is possible, that after the firing pass the pilot can dive away to safety, regroup, attack again from altitude. Adair has no such option. He is attacking a formation protected by 40 fighters. The moment he opens fire, every Oscar in the escort will converge on him. He cannot fight them all. He cannot outrun them all. But he can, perhaps, create enough chaos and fear that the bomber formation breaks up, aborts its mission, turns away from the target. If Japanese commanders see a fighter willing to attack suicidally, they may assume more fighters are diving from altitude. They may believe this lone P-40 is the advance element of a squadron. Fear and uncertainty can disrupt formations as effectively as bullets. This is the logic, if it can be called logic, that guides Adair's decision in the seconds before he enters gun range. He selects the lead bomber in the formation and centers it in his gun sight. The shark mouth painted on Lulu Bell's nose seems to grin at the approaching enemy. At 400 yards, he squeezes the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously, their tracers converging on the bomber's fuselage. The effect is immediate and devastating. Pieces of metal tear away from the Sally's wing root. Smoke trails from one engine. The bomber lurches out of formation, its pilot fighting for control. Adair holds the trigger down, walking his fire across the formation, stitching holes through another bomber's tail section, 3 Oscars follow him down. They are lighter, more agile, but their pilots fear high-speed dives that have killed Japanese flyers when their aircraft came apart under stress. At 450 miles per hour, Adair's P-40 is approaching its maximum design speed. The controls are heavy, unresponsive. The entire airframe vibrates. But the aircraft holds together. American engineering, American steel, American rivets, and welds designed for exactly this abuse. He levels out at 5,000 feet, the pursuing Oscars falling back, unable or unwilling to match his dive speed. He has perhaps 30 seconds before the fighters above can descend and resume the attack. He uses those seconds to assess damage. His aircraft has taken hits. Bullet holes perforate the left wing. Hydraulic fluid streams from a severed line. The control stick feels wrong, disconnected, as though the cables linking it to the control surfaces have been partially cut. Any rational pilot would use these 30 seconds to point the nose toward home and run. Adair instead hauls back on the stick and climbs, angling back toward the bomber formation. He has not broken the strike force. The bombers continue southwest, closer to the base. His attack has cost them 2 aircraft damaged, but has not turned them away. They believe, correctly, that one P-40 cannot stop them. They are flying into the teeth of their target, and one suicidal American pilot is an acceptable cost. But Adair's transmission has reached his squadron. On the airfield, pilots sprint toward their aircraft. Ground crews fire starter cartridges. Engines cough to life. The first P-40s are taxiing, not yet airborne, but moving, preparing. They need minutes. Adair will give them minutes. He climbs back through 15,000 feet and spots the formation again. The Oscars have tightened their escort, anticipating another attack. They are waiting for him. He comes at them from a different angle this time, slicing through the formation from the side, aiming for a bomber on the formation's edge. His guns hammer again. The bomber's cockpit shatters. Its nose drops. It falls away smoking. But before Adair can extend away, an Oscar pilot anticipates his escape route and positions perfectly. Cannon shells, 20mm rounds carrying explosive charges, strike Lulu Bell's fuselage. One punches through the canopy inches from Adair's head. Another detonates against the armor plate behind his seat, the shrapnel absorbed by steel designed for exactly this purpose. The third hits the control surface connection for his elevator, severing cables that allow the pilot to pitch the aircraft up or down. The stick goes loose in his hand. Lulu Bell's nose drops uncontrollably. She is mortally wounded, losing altitude, her controls responding only partially to Adair's desperate inputs. The rational decision, the decision every manual and every instructor demands, is to bail out. He has perhaps 60 seconds before the aircraft becomes unflyable. Japanese fighters circle overhead, waiting for him to jump so they can strafe his parachute. If he stays with the aircraft, he will crash. If he jumps, he might be shot while descending or might land in territory held by Japanese forces notorious for executing captured airmen. Neither option offers survival. But there is a third option that is not rational, that makes no sense, that violates every principle of self-preservation. He can stay with Lulu Bell and attempt to fly her home. Not level flight. The severed elevator cables make that impossible. But he still has aileron control. He can roll. He can use the rudder. And gravity, which is currently pulling him down, can be manipulated through inverted flight and rolling maneuvers. It is improvisation born of desperation and intimate knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities. He rolls Lulu Bell inverted, hanging upside down in his straps, and uses the rudder to pull the nose toward the horizon in what amounts to an inverted climb. The Japanese pilots, expecting him to bail out or crash, are caught off guard. They break formation to pursue, but Adair rolls level again and pushes the stick forward, a motion that should pitch the nose down, but with severed elevator cables does almost nothing. He compensates by rolling into knife-edge flight, using the rudder to yaw the nose downward, then rolling wings level again as the aircraft descends. It is flying through pure improvisation, translating control inputs through combinations that should not work, but somehow do. The Japanese pilots, watching this impossible display of airmanship, hesitate. They have been trained to attack bombers in formation, to engage fighters in turning dogfights where their superior maneuverability gives advantage. They have never encountered a pilot flying an aircraft with catastrophic control damage who refuses to abandon it, who instead manipulates it through three-dimensional space using techniques they do not understand and cannot predict. Some Japanese pilots break off, returning to their formations. Others continue pursuing but fire tentatively, unsure whether this erratic target is worth the ammunition. Adair does not care about their reasoning. He cares only about maintaining airspeed, about keeping Lulu Bell from stalling and spinning into the ground, about nursing her toward home through a series of rolling maneuvers that look insane from the outside but are the only way to maintain controlled flight with his limited remaining controls. Behind him, other P-40s are climbing into the sky. The Burma Banshees have scrambled. The Japanese strike force, harassed by Adair's repeated attacks and now facing a squadron of interceptors, breaks formation and turns away. The mission is aborted. The base is saved. But Philip Adair is still flying a dying aircraft through hostile sky, and his ordeal is not over. He crosses the front lines at 8,000 feet, losing altitude steadily, the Allison engine running rough from battle damage, the airframe shaking as aerodynamic forces work against damaged structure. He cannot see his base yet. He can see only jungle, endless, unforgiving, deadly to anyone forced to land in it. Other Burma Banshees form up on his wings, their pilots calling encouragement over the radio, offering advice, watching helplessly as Adair fights to keep Lulu Bell airborne. One pilot suggests he bail out now, while he still has altitude. Adair ignores him. He has not survived 30 minutes of combat and flown this aircraft through impossible conditions just to abandon her in sight of home. The airfield appears ahead, a strip of packed earth carved from jungle, utterly inadequate for a normal landing and beyond inadequate for an aircraft with no elevator control. Landing requires the ability to flare, to pull the nose up at the last moment to arrest descent. Adair cannot flare. If he attempts a standard landing approach, he will smash into the runway at whatever descent rate he carries. He needs an alternative. He finds it in physics and geometry. He positions Lulu Bell 5 miles from the field and begins a shallow, descending spiral. By rolling continuously and using the rudder to control his turn, he bleeds off airspeed while maintaining a controlled descent. The spiral tightens as he approaches the field. Other pilots have landed and now stand beside the runway, watching this impossible approach. Ground crews emerge from revetments. The entire squadron witnesses what comes next. At 500 feet, Adair rolls wings level for the final approach. His airspeed is barely above stall, 110 miles per hour indicated, far too slow for a combat approach, but the only speed that gives him any chance of survival. He cannot pull back on the stick. He cannot flare. But he can, in the final seconds, use the throttle. He cuts power completely. Gravity does the rest. Lulu Bell's nose drops slightly. The aircraft descends the final 100 feet in what amounts to a controlled crash. The main wheels hit first, absorbing the impact, then the tail wheel slams down. The P-40 bounces once, settles, rolls down the runway trailing dust and hydraulic fluid and pieces of damaged structure that shake loose from the landing stress. Adair lets her roll until momentum dies, then turns off the engine. Silence descends. He sits in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, unwilling or unable to move. When he finally unbuckles and climbs down, his legs nearly buckle. Ground crews rush forward and stop, staring at Lulu Bell. The left wing is shredded. The fuselage is perforated with over 150 bullet and cannon holes. The elevator control runs are severed. By any rational assessment, the aircraft should not have flown. The pilot should not have survived. For the Japanese pilots who witnessed Adair's attack that morning, the encounter represented something more disturbing than simple tactical defeat. They had expected to face a defense. American fighters were operating in the theater, and encountering resistance was neither surprising nor particularly concerning. Japanese doctrine, developed through 2 years of combat experience, emphasized that American pilots could be intimidated, that sufficient numbers would cause them to break off and flee, that the mystique of the Zero and its successors would create psychological advantage. But the pilot they encountered that morning did not flee. He attacked a formation 64 aircraft strong with a single fighter. He attacked repeatedly despite taking damage. And when his aircraft was mortally wounded, when any sane pilot would bail out, he instead flew it home through improvisations that violated every principle of aerodynamics they understood. This was not the behavior they expected from American pilots. It was closer to the behavior Japanese culture associated with samurai warriors willing to die for duty, an irony that did not escape the more thoughtful among them. American propaganda emphasized that democratic soldiers fought reluctantly, that citizens drafted into military service lacked the martial spirit of professional warriors. Yet here was proof of something different. A citizen soldier demonstrating courage indistinguishable from the fatalism that Japanese commanders demanded of their own pilots. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If American pilots would sacrifice themselves as readily as Japanese pilots, if American aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft and still fly, if American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them, then the fundamental assumptions of Japanese strategy were flawed. The Zero might outturn the P-40 in a dogfight. Japanese pilots might possess superior training in aerobatics. But these advantages meant nothing if American pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms. If they exploited the P-40's diving speed and structural strength, if they understood that trading altitude for speed created tactical advantages that negated maneuverability. The transformation in perception worked both ways. American pilots who heard the story of Adair's engagement spread it through the theater with the speed that only combat veterans can achieve. Details varied in the retelling. Some versions claimed he shot down 5 aircraft, others said 10, a few exaggerated to 20. The actual number confirmed by gun camera footage and post-combat analysis was more modest: 2 bombers destroyed, 1 fighter damaged, several others driven off. But the specific kill count mattered less than the principle it demonstrated. One P-40, properly flown by a pilot who understood the aircraft's strengths and accepted personal risk, could disrupt a massive strike force. The P-40 was obsolescent by late 1943. American factories were producing P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, fighters with superior performance in almost every metric. The P-40's remaining virtue was its ruggedness, the ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting. Adair's survival proved this virtue was not theoretical. A Japanese fighter hit by cannon shells would have exploded or broken apart. The Oscar and Zero sacrificed protection for performance. But the P-40, overbuilt by Japanese standards, could be shot full of holes and still bring its pilot home. This was not romantic. It was industrial warfare distilled to first principles. American aircraft were designed by engineers who assumed pilots wanted to survive, who added armor and redundant systems even though they reduced performance. Japanese aircraft were designed by engineers working under severe resource constraints who maximized performance by eliminating everything not essential to flying and fighting. Both approaches had logic, but in sustained attritional combat where replacing trained pilots took longer than replacing aircraft, the American approach proved superior. The sound that came to symbolize this philosophy was not the scream of a diving fighter or the hammering of machine guns, but something more mundane. The grinding rumble of the Allison V-1710 engine, still running, still producing power, after taking damage that should have destroyed it. Ground crews examining Lulu Bell after Adair's landing found shrapnel embedded in the engine block, oil lines punctured, cooling systems compromised. Yet the engine had continued running long enough to bring the pilot home. This reliability was not accident, but design philosophy. Allison engines were over-engineered, heavier than necessary, with safety margins built into every component. Japanese engines extracted maximum power from minimum weight, pushing materials to their limits, accepting higher failure rates as the cost of performance. For a nation with limited industrial capacity fighting a defensive war, the Japanese approach made strategic sense. For a nation with vast industrial capacity fighting a war of attrition across 2 oceans, the American approach was strategically correct. Every P-40 that returned to base despite catastrophic damage was a pilot saved, a training investment preserved, an experienced aviator who would fly again. Every Zero that exploded from a single hit was a pilot lost, often an experienced veteran whose replacement would be less skilled. The cumulative effect of these small engineering decisions, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and millions of flight hours, shaped the war's outcome as surely as any battle. Philip Adair was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that morning. the nation's third highest decoration for valor. The citation described his extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, and noted that his actions reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Forces. He would fly 58 more combat missions before his tour ended, accumulating 3 confirmed kills and 5 probables. He survived the war, returned to South Carolina, married, raised a family, worked as a civilian. In interviews decades later, he described the December 13th mission with the understated matter-of-factness common among combat veterans. He had done what needed doing. The aircraft had performed as designed. His training had prepared him adequately. The enemy had been disrupted. His friends had survived. These were facts, not grounds for exceptional praise. But the squadron that heard his story saw something different. Evidence that audacity combined with technical knowledge could overcome impossible odds. That understanding one's aircraft intimately allowed improvisation that looked like magic, but was actually skilled application of aerodynamic principles under extreme pressure. The lesson spread through training schools and operational units. Instructors teaching new P-40 pilots began emphasizing the aircraft's structural strength, its ability to dive faster than any Japanese fighter, its rugged reliability. They told Adair's story not as inspiration but as tactical doctrine. Know your aircraft's strengths, exploit enemy weaknesses, accept risks when mission requires, and never underestimate what an obsolescent fighter can accomplish when flown by a pilot who refuses to quit. The Japanese commanders who debriefed their pilots after the aborted strike ordered increased fighter escorts for future missions in the sector. Intelligence reports noted that American defenses in Assam had improved, that a squadron of aggressive fighters was now based there, that future strikes would require overwhelming force to succeed. They did not know that their formation had been disrupted by a single P-40. Their pilots, embarrassed by their failure to destroy one damaged aircraft, reported engaging multiple fighters. The truth, that Second Lieutenant Adair had harassed them alone for 10 minutes while flying an aircraft with severed flight controls, remained hidden in the confusion of combat reports and the reluctance of survivors to describe their own inadequacies. But some Japanese pilots understood. They had watched that P-40 dive through their formation repeatedly, had seen it take hits that should have been fatal, had witnessed impossible flight when the American should have bailed out. They recognized skilled airmanship when they saw it, regardless of nationality. And they understood, perhaps better than their commanders, that they were facing an enemy who would not quit, who possessed aircraft that could absorb punishment, who enjoyed industrial support that allowed losses to be replaced within days, while Japanese losses took months to replace. The mathematics of attrition favored their enemy. Courage alone could not overcome that disparity. By late 1943, the transformation in combat dynamics was accelerating. New American fighters, P-38s, P-47s, F-4U Corsairs, F-6F Hellcats, were arriving in the Pacific with performance that exceeded Japanese aircraft in almost every category. Even the obsolescent P-40 continued serving effectively because pilots understood how to use it. The hit-and-run tactics Chenault pioneered with the Flying Tigers became standard doctrine across the theater. Never dogfight. Use altitude. Dive fast. Shoot. Escape. The P-40's diving speed advantage meant Japanese fighters could not catch it. The P-40's structural strength meant it survived damage. The P-40's heavy armament, 6 50-caliber machine guns firing 5,400 rounds per minute combined, meant that even brief firing passes inflicted devastating damage. These were not glamorous virtues. They were workmanlike qualities that allowed average pilots to survive and skilled pilots to excel. Adair was not the most decorated P-40 pilot. He was not the highest-scoring ace. But his December 13th mission demonstrated what the aircraft could accomplish when tactical doctrine, pilot skill, and sheer determination converged. He faced odds that should have meant certain death. He improvised solutions to problems that should have been unsolvable. And he brought himself and his aircraft home through flying skill that bordered on superhuman, but was actually the result of hundreds of hours in the cockpit, of understanding the P-40's flight envelope intimately, of knowing instinctively how to trade energy states and exploit 3-axis control even when one axis was effectively destroyed. The recurring sound in Philip Adair's memory of that morning, the sound he would recall decades later in quiet moments, was not the hammering of his guns, or the shriek of incoming rounds, or the explosions that rocked his aircraft. It was the steady, grinding rumble of Lulu Bell's Allison engine, still running, still producing power, refusing to quit even when it should have failed. That sound represented more than mechanical reliability. It represented the philosophy that guided American aircraft design, that pilots' lives mattered, that bringing them home was as important as getting them to the fight, that over-engineering and redundancy were features rather than wasteful excess. Japanese engineers maximized performance by eliminating safety margins. American engineers accepted reduced performance to ensure survival. Both approaches reflected their nation's different circumstances and strategic requirements. But in a long war of attrition where trained pilots became irreplaceable assets, the American approach proved decisive. Every pilot who survived to fly another mission, every aircraft that limped home despite catastrophic damage, every ground crew that repaired what should have been total losses, these accumulated advantages that mathematics could not capture but strategy could not ignore. The Zero was in many ways a superior dogfighter to the P-40, but the Zero burned when hit. The Zero's pilot died when the aircraft was damaged. The P-40 absorbed punishment and brought pilots home. And pilots who survived learned from each encounter, improved their tactics, passed knowledge to replacement pilots, created institutional expertise that compounded over time. The epilogue to Adair's story is written not in official histories or military records, but in the lives of the men who did not die that morning because one pilot refused to let 64 enemy aircraft reach their target unmolested. The Burma Banshees who scrambled while Adair harassed the strike force intercepted Japanese bombers before they could release their loads. Several bombers were destroyed. The remainder jettisoned their bombs over jungle and fled. The base suffered no damage. No personnel were killed. No aircraft on the ground were destroyed. These negative outcomes, the deaths that did not occur, the destruction that did not happen, represent Adair's true victory. Military history records battles and casualties. It struggles to quantify the cost of things prevented, lives saved, disasters averted. But every pilot who scrambled that morning owed their survival to the 10 minutes Adair bought them. Every mechanic and clerk and cook who would have died in the bombing owed their life to one pilot's decision to engage impossible odds rather than accept the rational conclusion that one fighter could not stop 64. The mathematics argued for retreat. Doctrine argued for preserving the aircraft and pilot for future missions. Self-preservation argued for bailing out when the aircraft was damaged beyond any reasonable expectation of controlled flight. Philip Adair ignored all of these arguments. He fought alone because fighting was required. He stayed with his damaged aircraft because landing it successfully was possible, however improbable. And he succeeded because the P-40 Warhawk, unfairly maligned as obsolescent and inadequate, was exactly what its designers intended: a rugged, reliable, survivable fighter that could absorb terrible punishment and still accomplish its mission. The sun sets over Assam on December 13, 1943, painting the jungle in shades of amber and crimson. Philip Adair sits outside the operations tent, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, listening to his squadron mates reconstruct the day's combat from fragmented radio transmissions and gun camera footage. They do not yet know how close the base came to destruction. They do not yet understand that one pilot's decision to attack alone disrupted an entire strike force. They know only that the Japanese bombers turned away, that the base is secure, that everyone survived. Tomorrow will bring more missions, more combat, more losses that cannot be prevented. But today is a day when duty and courage and the rugged reliability of American engineering combine to achieve what should have been impossible. The lesson is not that one pilot can defeat 64 enemies through superior skill alone. The lesson is that systems designed for survival amplify the effectiveness of skilled pilots. That doctrine developed through hard experience in combat allows inferior aircraft to defeat superior enemies, and that sometimes the margin between disaster and salvation is measured not in firepower or speed or maneuverability, but in one pilot's refusal to accept the verdict of mathematics. Philip Adair did not seek to become a hero that morning. He sought to buy time for his squadron to scramble. He succeeded because the P-40, designed by engineers who believed pilots' lives mattered, gave him the tools to fight and survive. The grinding rumble of that Allison engine, still running after taking hits that should have destroyed it, was the sound of American industrial philosophy made audible, the belief that ruggedness and reliability matter as much as performance, that bringing pilots home is as important as sending them into battle, and that the capacity to absorb punishment and continue fighting is itself a form of victory. That sound echoes still through the history of the Pacific War, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories are the disasters that never happened because someone refused to let them.